She stepped out of the red dust with dried blood on her hands and said, "By dawn tomorrow, they'll hang me." And him. He just opened the door. No one knew where she came from. No one asked why her dress was stained with blood, or why there was no fear left in her eyes. But at Cedar Hollow Ranch, just as the sun bled out behind the hills and the wind carried the scent of old smoke, a woman appeared, not asking for water, not begging for mercy. She spoke only one sentence, and it struck like a bullet to the heart of a man who'd been surviving on silence and the memory of a wife buried too deep to dig up. He didn't ask, didn't doubt. Just pushed open the weathered wooden door, the one that had once marked the line between life and death, and let her step inside. That night, the ranch had one more soul, and maybe a reason for someone to stay, or for everything to fall apart all over again. Montana Territory, autumn 1888. The sun had long since slipped behind the ridgeline, leaving a faint streak of light across the land, like an old trace of rouge on the earth's lips. The sky wore the color of ash and burnished brass, the horizon blurring where the heavens met the prairie, nothing but the weary in-between of day and night. Like a trumpet once sounded there but fell silent halfway through, its player gone without warning. To the south of Cedar Hollow Ranch, the hanging wooden gate creaked on its hinges. The wind wasn't strong, but the rusted joints made a tired groan, like an old man sighing in his sleep. Eli Thatcher looked up from the porch where he sat mending the stockyard ropes. One hand gripped a curved needle, the other braced a frayed line of twine. Behind him, the dying light cast a long shadow across the red dirt, blending into a rising trail of dust disturbed by something, or someone, approaching from the pasture trail. It wasn't wind. It was footsteps, steady, unhidden, and unhurried. Not a march, not a cry for help. Just the kind of walk that said whoever was coming had nothing behind them worth going back for. Beneath the swing of the lantern he'd just hung above the porch, she came into view. A woman, her head slightly bowed, her stance slanted as if weariness had seeped all the way into her spine. Her dress was caked in mud from knee to hem, the fabric at her sleeves bunched tight, and her back bore a tear crudely stitched shut with gray thread. In her right hand, she clutched a crumpled cowboy hat, its brim stained with dried blood, brown-red and clinging with dust. Smoke clung faintly to her, drifting off the tangled hair caught in her collar. She didn't speak, didn't step up to the porch. She just stood there, like a scarecrow bent in the desert wind, like a warning carved from flesh that had outlived the telling of its own story. Her eyes found Eli, not pleading, not probing, just looking, as if searching for something in him that wouldn't need to be spoken to understand. And then, after a silence longer than breath, she said it. One sentence. Steady. Low. Without rise or fall. "They mean to hang me come morning." Her voice was rough, like a splinter cutting through pine bark. Not from crying. She was long past tears. Eli stood. The wooden chair he'd made when Sarah was still alive gave a soft groan under his weight. He didn't ask who, didn't glance at her hands for weapons. He walked to the front door of the cabin, the one with a broken latch since the previous winter, and pushed it open, just wide enough for a woman to pass, without brushing the corner of the shrine that still stood by the hearth. He left it open, then returned to the porch, picked up an old shawl Sarah used to wear when she gathered wild grapes, and laid it on the top step. The woman didn't move at once, She stared at the threshold, like it marked the line between what kills and what lets live. But then she crossed it. Not quickly, not cautiously, just as one who no longer has any place left to go. The floorboards creaked beneath her. One heel broken on her boot left smudges in her wake. Eli didn't watch her enter. His gaze stayed fixed on the horizon, where the last streaks of cloud hung blood-red across a bruised sky. Inside, the lamp hadn't been lit. The air held the faint breath of burned wood. The ashes in the stove were still warm, but bore no flame. She placed her hat down by the door, didn't wipe the blood, didn't try to hide it, left it there for whoever needed to know. On the table, a porcelain cup bore the stain of old coffee, likely from a batch burnt too dark that morning. A plate showed the gleam of leftover grease, small, ordinary things. But in their quiet, they bore witness. Someone had lived here, had loved, had once set a spoon down softly so as not to break the peace. She sat. Didn't ask for a towel. Didn't request a blanket. But Eli fetched one anyway, from the spare chair, worn and folded, and laid it across the back of hers. Then he moved to the wash basin, turned on the rain tap, and let the cold water fall over his hands. Not to wash, just to give his fingers something to do while his heart weighed the choice he'd just made, and found it right. Outside the window, wind began to stir. Dry grass brushed the siding with the sound of fingers knocking gently. Not to disturb, but to remind. Night was arriving. She pulled the blanket over her shoulders. The fabric smelled old, not sweet, but safe. Her head rested against the back of the chair, her eyes turning toward the hearth, where no fire burned, yet the ashes still held a faint trace of orange at the edges. Eli poured himself a cup of water, set it on the table. No one spoke. But in the hush between them, something passed, a kind of pact, not written on paper or sealed in blood, but in the small acts of a door opened, a blanket shared, a question left unasked. And beyond the walls, night began to fall across the red earth like a thick, heavy quilt. Cedar Hollow entered a night meant for two, though that very morning there'd only been one. The wind blew down from the north across the low hills, carrying with it the dry tang of late-season grass and the faint remains of last night's campfire. The weathered wooden fence, bleached by years of sun, shivered slightly, as if reminding itself it was still standing. The old windmill turned slow against a sky the color of bone. With every creak of its metal frame, it joined the sighs of cattle scattered across the dusty yard. In the distance, a few horses stood near the trough, their shadows stretching long through the brittle barley stalks like strokes of thin ink on red clay. Eli Thatcher had lived alone nearly 4 years. He didn't count the days, but in every patch he sewed into the back of an old shirt. In every morning he brewed just 1 cup of coffee. In every evening he set the table for one. He knew what it meant to live alongside absence. The 2-story cabin wasn't large, but it was big enough for memories to settle into every corner. He and Sarah, his red-haired wife, had built it by hand before the fever took her in the frozen winter of 1884. Their wedding photograph still hung on the wall by the stairs. Next to it, a small shelf held the odd little treasures she'd once gathered: a purple-veined stone, a broken silver spoon, a few dried wildflowers pressed into an old book. No one had replaced Sarah. Not because Eli never thought of it, but because everything in that house had been built with a kind of trust he no longer believed could be rebuilt. When she died, he didn't fall apart. He simply folded away the world that had once held two people and lived in what was left. Each morning, he still rose before dawn, lit the stove, made his coffee. He still tended the stock, checked the pens, recorded the day's tasks in a leather-bound journal with steady handwriting. But he no longer hummed while brushing down the horses. He didn't place wildflowers on the kitchen sill like he once had. A man like Eli, one didn't need to hear him speak to know, had survived loss by keeping away from anything that could be lost again. Until someone knocked on the southern gate yesterday evening. Nora Bellamy hadn't spoken of herself that night, but the next morning, while Eli was out early checking on the calves, she stood by the fence, eyes on the mist-veiled land, and let the past return with the wind. Nora had been the youngest daughter of a carpenter's family in southern Utah. Her father, Mr. Bellamy, was known for crafting rosewood pews for churches up and down the frontier. Her mother had died young, leaving 3 girls in the hands of a strict and sharp-tempered man. Nora was different from her sisters. She couldn't cook well, nor sew a straight hem, but she could listen to wood. As a child, she would sneak into the workshop and press her ear to a fresh plank of pine and whisper, "It's singing, Papa." Mr. Bellamy never answered things like that, but he didn't send her away either, and to Nora, that was its own quiet form of permission. When she was 17, a wealthy man from Colorado visited their workshop. He commissioned a walnut bookshelf and, while it was being built, stayed for many suppers. Nora called him the man with the silk hat, because unlike local men, his hat never gathered dust. He spoke gently, called her the girl who hears wood, and promised to take her somewhere without the smell of sweat or kitchen ash. Her father nodded. Her sister packed her bag. No one asked Nora what she wanted. That marriage lasted less than a year. The man with the silk hat brought her east to a small Colorado town, not to be a wife but to show her off like some peculiar ornament. He paraded her at dances, forced her into dresses too tight, lips too red, and smiled whenever someone asked, "Where'd you find a girl with skin that's sun-warmed?" Nora learned silence. She learned how to stand beside someone and be invisible. But some things cannot be learned, like how to swallow a slap when she refused to drink with his friends, or how to disappear when he locked her up for 3 days after she spilled a glass of wine on his desk. She left that house on a moonlit night, taking nothing but a pair of boots with broken heels and the very hat he once gave her, now stained with blood from a struggle neither of them would speak of again. Since then, she had headed north, through forgotten towns, working odd jobs at inns, sleeping in horse stalls, avoiding the eyes of men in uniform. The words, "They mean to hang me," weren't entirely metaphor. Somewhere near Idaho, a man had died after an argument in a grain barn. Nora had been there. She said nothing else, but from the way her hand clutched that blood-stained hat, from the way she met Eli's gaze without flinching, it was clear. She had lived through what no one should. She wasn't running from guilt. She was running because the world would never let her explain how it really happened. That afternoon, Eli returned home just as the sun tipped westward over the hills. He saw Nora kneeling beneath the wild apple tree by the fence, picking through fallen fruit, brushing aside what had rotted, placing the still good ones into a basket. No one had told her to do it, but she did. As if, by saving what wasn't spoiled, one might believe there was still something in themselves worth saving, too. He didn't call out, didn't walk over, just stood a moment on the porch, eyes fixed on the tree, where her silhouette bent with the amber light and scent of autumn leaves. Like a watercolor, that had blurred with time but somehow still held one last trace of grace. And in that moment, he knew the woman was no longer a stranger. She was part of the evening now. The oil lamp burned low on the dinner table. Its dim yellow glow cast the fireplace's shadow across the wood-paneled wall, smearing shapes like old memories too long left unnamed. The scent of beef stew lingered in the air, warm, gentle, touched with the faint bitterness of onions charred at the bottom of the pot. But neither had lifted a spoon. Nora sat by the hearth, wrapped in a beige wool blanket that once belonged to Sarah. Her eyes rested half shut, but her fingers still clung to the edge of the blanket like someone who'd never been given permission to let go. Eli stood at the wash basin, in his hand a glass dulled by dust. His wrist moved in slow, steady circles, not scrubbing the glass so much as working through the silence that thickened in the kitchen. No one asked names. No one apologized for arriving too suddenly. There was only the soft crack of firewood, the distant drip of water from the apple tree branch outside, and the first snowfall of the season drifting down. It wasn't much snow, but it was the first after a long, dry stretch, just enough to blur the window panes, bead cold along the eaves, and melt slowly off the leather boots left by the door. Those boots were Nora's. Eli had placed a folded cloth beneath them so the melt wouldn't run across the floor. He hadn't said a word, just did it. Nora shifted slightly, as if to adjust the blanket, but stopped when her fingers brushed against a patch sewn long ago. She let her hand rest there a moment before pulling it back. For a long time, neither moved. The air inside the house felt suspended, not just from the weather, but from the two souls within it. One had outrun the rope meant to hang her. The other had outlived a funeral no one else had witnessed. And now they sat in a kitchen unchanged since 1884. On the table, the stew still steamed. The spoon Eli had laid beside it hadn't moved. He knew she might not eat. He wouldn't blame her. Those who arrive at the edge of survival rarely feel hunger first. But he cooked anyway. Not for hospitality, but because you don't let the fire die when there's still human breath inside the house. He washed another plate, water dripping from his sleeves. On the wall, the wedding photograph had dimmed beneath a layer of dust. Sarah wore a plain dress, her hair braided neatly, standing beside Eli in a worn cowboy shirt, sleeves already fraying. Nora didn't look at it, but the oil lamp's glow caught it just right, so the picture almost seemed to look back at her. A creak from the upstairs loft. The black cat Eli had raised, gone since early summer, returned without warning. It stepped down softly, eyes wide at the sight of a stranger. Nora tilted her head. The cat leapt into her lap. No meow, just curled into the part of the blanket where the stitches had come undone. For the first time that night, her lips pressed together. Not into a smile, but not trembling either. Eli said nothing. He stepped back, took the seat, across from her by the hearth, and sat, hands resting on his knees. They were 4 paces apart, but in that space something real had already happened. Neither of them left. The fire burned slow, reflecting off the wall clock long stuck at 6:43. It might have been the moment Sarah died, or just some forgotten evening when Eli stopped winding the key. Outside, snow kept falling. The wind tapped the window gently, pulling a soft whimper from the kitchen door hinge. But inside, things were calm enough for Eli to notice the scent of damp wool and sun-browned hair coming from the woman seated opposite him. No one spoke, but both knew the other was still awake. And that, more than anything, was the strange part. Not the fugitive, not the hunted, but the presence of silence that didn't make anyone feel alone. The cat stirred again, rubbed its head against Nora. She stroked its back. Her hands were calloused, fingernails rimmed with earth, but they didn't shake. She might leave tomorrow. She might not. But in that moment, amid wind-brushing shingles, lamplight flickering soft, and a heartbeat steady as still water, someone had sat long enough in that kitchen for the fire not to die. Eli glanced down at his hands, soap powder still clinging to his skin. He rubbed it into his sleeve and looked up. Nora had fallen asleep. The blanket rose to her shoulders. The cat lay still, and her face at rest bore no trace of the woman who stood at his gate with a voice like a death sentence. It was softer, more tired, and real. He stood, walked lightly to the window, and slid the wooden latch into place. Then turned back, gently moving the chair by the door farther aside, as if to clear a path, should she choose to leave come morning. But before heading upstairs, he paused, didn't look at Nora. He looked at the untouched stew, the sleeping cat, and the hearth still holding a quiet flame. The door wasn't shut all the way, only drawn close. And for the first time in 4 years, Eli didn't lock it. Morning light slanted through the frost-glazed windowpane, spilling across the dining table where breadcrumbs from the night before still clung to the wood. Eli came down the stairs with slow steps, smoothing the hem of his shirt, as though bracing against something unseen, a disquiet that lingered from the night past, from the stranger still in his house. The scent of coffee had already filled the kitchen. He wasn't used to someone waking before him. Not since Sarah died had anyone ever stoked the fire this early. But today, the stove glowed warm. The coffee pot sat on the iron rack, and steam drifted softly, bearing the sharp, bitter edge of over-roasted beans. Nora hadn't left. She was there, still wearing the same dress as yesterday, though her hair was pulled up neat, and her hands bore signs of water and soap. She didn't look up when Eli stepped in. She just nudged a cup toward the edge of the table, far enough that he could reach without needing to refuse. Beside the coffee pot sat a folded handkerchief, embroidered with an S he knew too well. It had once belonged to Sarah, kept in the left drawer of the china hutch. Every now and then, Eli would take it out just to breathe in the last traces of lavender. But now it had been used, clean, scentless, folded smooth, as though someone had wiped away a rough night and returned it with both hands. He said nothing, poured the coffee, sat. Nora didn't speak right away. Her eyes were fixed out the window. The morning sun lit up the skin along her neck. Uneven tones, sun-darkened patches, the kind of markings you get from years spent outdoors, with no roof overhead and no time for mirrors. "He locked me in the stable for a whole winter," she said, her voice flat, like she was talking about the weather. Eli didn't look up, but his hand paused halfway to his mouth. "Said I needed to learn obedience, because I was the future wife, because in that town, his word was law." There was no hitch in her throat, no tears. Her words didn't fall like stones. They settled, low and dust-like, into the air between them. "He was the mayor, and my godfather. Legal papers, signatures. I was just a foster kid taken in after the flood." Nora's fingertip brushed the rim of her cup. She didn't drink, just rested her hand there, as if the coffee gave her a reason to remain seated. "I didn't kill him, but I saw him fall off the porch chasing after me. That rock was already there. Not mine. She didn't go on. Didn't justify, didn't plead. But in her eyes, Eli saw something that made his throat drier than the bitter coffee. It wasn't grief, it wasn't fear. It was that kind of exhaustion that gets into the bone, like a trail horse that's been out too long, no longer startled by the crack of a gun, only slowing to brace for the final collapse. When I ran, I wasn't thinking. Didn't know where to go, but somehow, my feet brought me here. Eli glanced, again, at the folded handkerchief. He remembered Sarah once said if it ever ended up in someone else's hands, the lavender might fade, but the folds would still hold if the hands were careful, and Nora had folded it, not to return a kindness, but as if to say, I know this isn't mine, but I used it like a person would. They stayed that way until the sun rose clean above the pines, throwing sharp light across the edge of the table. Eli reached for his tin of hand-rolled tobacco, fingers lifting from old habit. But he set it back down. No match struck. No one's tracking me, Nora said. No one dirty enough to help would bother. It wasn't bitterness, wasn't hope. Just a statement from someone who'd held her hand out too many times and never once had it held back. Eli drank his coffee, cold, bitter, but he didn't flinch. If there's work to be done here, she added, voice so quiet it only carried because the house was so still, you can tell me. Fence needs fixing after the storm, Eli answered, his voice steady as level earth. And a few horses need walking out to pasture. Nora nodded, didn't smile, didn't thank him. But for the first time in days, her back straightened and her eyes turned toward the place where work waited. Eli stood, placed his cup in the basin, didn't wash it, just stepped out the door, pushing with a firm hand so the wooden latch wouldn't squeal. Nora remained, cleared the table, wiped the faint print her hand had left on the wood. The door didn't close behind him, and inside, the scent of lavender was truly gone. But something else hung in its place, newer, earthier, like the smell of rain in dirt, not clean, but enough to believe that something could be planted again. That afternoon, wind swept across the thinning fields, bending what was left of the silvered grass. Eli hitched the horse to the wagon without explanation, took only his hat, his coat, and a look in his eyes that had been decided before sunrise. He said he'd be back before dark. Nora didn't ask why. She just gave a small nod, then turned back to sorting the rotted lumber behind the stable. She worked alone all afternoon, not out of debt, not out of duty. Just because her hands didn't know how to be still, and quiet had a way of stirring thoughts better left buried, unless drowned out by the sound of blade on wood or hoofbeats far off down the dirt road. By the time the sun brushed the ridge to the west, red dust rose once again along the lane. Eli's wagon creaked into view, wheels groaning like old friends returning to a house long grown used to silence. He didn't bring food, no medicine, no supplies, just a folded paper tucked inside the pocket of his shirt, right where the heart beats. At the porch, he removed his hat and dusted it off. The wind caught in his graying hair. The air carried the scent of old ash and dried wildflowers, laced with the faint ink of fresh print, the kind of ink that meant there'd be no taking things back. He laid the paper on the wooden table, beside the unlit oil lamp. The words were few. A date, a line of acknowledgement. 3 signatures, plain and sufficient. Enough for the Wyoming Territory to recognize a truth. They were now married. Nora entered moments later, hands still dusty with splinters, a single straw thread caught in her hair like a needle. She didn't touch the paper, but she stood and looked at it for a long while. "You need a reason to make me stay?" That question was never spoken aloud, but Eli heard it, or maybe just imagined he did. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. He just pulled out a chair and waited. Nora sat. Her hand rested near the paper, not touching, but not pulling away either. After a long silence, she gave a nod. No more words were said. Eli stood, opened a drawer beneath the table, and took out an old key, its handle set with a small pearl now dulled by time. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking as if the wood remembered Sarah's lighter tread. He opened the east bedroom. The scent of cinnamon and old soap still clung faintly to the pillows. Nothing had changed much in that room. At the foot of the bed sat a cedar chest, and inside, folded with care, was Sarah's wedding dress, tucked away since their riverside ceremony more than a decade ago. Eli didn't open the chest. He only laid the key atop it and turned away. Nora entered after. The door closed behind her without a sound. She sat on the edge of the bed, fingers tracing the grain of the wood. The lock wasn't hard to turn. She slid the key into place slowly, as though untying the quiet knots left unnamed for years. The dress was still intact. The lace at the collar had faded to cream, the sleeves hand-stitched in careful rows, a garment sewn by a woman who once believed in the simple peace of quiet days. Nora didn't try it on. She knew it wouldn't fit. But she didn't need it to. She only needed to wrap it around herself like the last embrace of forgiveness, not for her sins, but for the grief someone else once held. She changed without a mirror. No earrings, no ribbon, just the fabric against skin weathered by wind and firelight, by forest nights and bruises no one had ever asked about. When she stepped out, she wore the same old shoes Sarah used to walk the fence line in. Her hair was tied low. Her hands held nothing. Eli stood on the porch, shirt newly pressed, belt cinched. The only witness was old Reverend McClellan, who lived 2 miles out. He arrived on horseback, a worn leather Bible under one arm. They stood beneath the porch roof, where the late sun slanted through a thin cloud. No smiles, no tears. The vows were read slowly, without pressure. When Eli was asked if he accepted, he nodded. When Nora was asked if she agreed, she met his eyes, steady, unblinking, and nodded back. There were no rings. They didn't need any. Only the sound of the Reverend's horse fading down the road. And one moment, short and still, when Eli turned and looked at her, standing in the golden hush of dusk. The dress didn't fit, but her eyes matched the peace this place could offer. And he knew this wasn't a marriage to begin love. It was a pact between 2 people who had lost everything, to make sure they didn't lose anything more. There was no celebration, no guests. But that night, Eli cleaned the kitchen, set out 2 new cups, and boiled water for Nora to wash her hair. She didn't say thank you. But the next morning, Sarah's handkerchief was folded once again, this time with a single dried flower tucked inside. In the stillness of the cabin, the oil lamp remained unlit. The kitchen was lit only by the flickering fire from the small stove, its light painting soft, smudged shadows across the wall, shadows like old memories, sometimes sharp, sometimes fading into each other. The night wind whispered through the window cracks, but the curtain didn't stir. Inside, everything held its breath, even time. Eli sat at the table, head bowed slightly, hands clasped in front of his chest as if in prayer, not to God, but to something within himself. Before him lay the marriage paper, a dry inked quill, and the stillness of two people saying nothing. Nora stood near the hearth, a light coat over her shoulders. The old white dress she wore bore a few flecks of ash from earlier that day. She hadn't brushed them off. They stayed, worn but not ruined, like her. There were no bells, no proclamation, no witnesses but the walls, the dying fire, and the scent of pine wood burning slow. They simply stood beside each other, near but not too close, just enough to hear each other's breath in the silence. Eli moved first. He rose, walked slowly toward her. Each step seemed to part a layer of old wind. When he reached her, he didn't reach out, just opened his palm, revealing something small. A silver ring, plain and dulled by time, but unbroken. Perhaps once taken off, perhaps once kept without knowing why. He didn't ask if she wanted to wear it. He just waited. Nora looked at it for a long while. There was no surprise in her eyes, no tears. Just a faint crease at the corner of her left eye, as though she'd seen this moment before, just hadn't known when it would arrive. Then she held out her hand. Eli slid the ring onto her finger with hands long trained in letting go. Not shaking, not hesitant. The motion was steady, as if it had once happened in another life, one where they hadn't had to run, hadn't signed papers for legality's sake, and hadn't come to each other through wounds that had already begun to scar over. The ring didn't gleam, but it fit. No resizing needed. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the clock ticked. Neither spoke. But something shifted. Not love, not belief, but a new kind of quiet. No longer cautious, no longer holding back, just a mutual understanding, wordless and absolute. We're not beginning from here, but from here we go on together. Eli touched Nora's hand, gently, no grip. His fingers bore calluses from tools and reins and fences. Hers were softer, but not delicate, like earth that had been turned and weathered, but still gave life. In that moment, there was no music, no poetry, only firelight, warm hands, and wind like a hidden witness. They didn't kiss, not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't need to. Some things aren't meant to be bound by ritual. They only ask for a touch held long enough, a gaze not turned away. Then Eli walked toward the stairs. He didn't go to the old bedroom. He stopped, at the first step, as if waiting for something unsaid to catch up. Nora placed her hand over her chest, right where the heart rested beneath coarse fabric. She moved toward him, barefoot, silent. She didn't ask him for anything, didn't request a room, didn't offer to share one. She just passed by him, leaving behind the faint scent of warm hair washed in bark-scented water. She climbed to the room Eli had cleaned that morning, where he'd changed the sheets, wiped the table, and laid a neatly folded towel on the pillow. The door closed behind her, but it didn't lock. The house returned to stillness. Eli blew out the lamp, letting the final glow from the stove burn down on its own. And that night, for the first time in nearly 4 years, He didn't sleep beneath the porch or in the armchair by the fire. He went upstairs, not to Sarah's old room, nor to the spare room off the main floor, but to the small room behind the tool shed, where the bed was plain wood, the walls held nothing but a coat hook, and the window looked out toward the stables, where the wind, all night long, had never once been kept out. Atop the eastern hill, the sun still hid behind a thick stretch of clouds, sagging low like a blanket corner left unmade. Its light did not spill across the fields as it usually did. Only a pale silver glow, hushed and weightless, made the earth seem like it hadn't quite woken yet. But the horse had. The sound of hooves came from the red dirt road outside the gates of Cedar Hollow. At first, distant and brittle, like the tap of a cane from an old man. Then clearer with each beat, cutting through the morning mist, crossing damp grasses still bowed with dew. Eli stood beneath the porch roof, a coffee pot in hand, steam curling gently upward. His shirt hung half-buttoned, hair still uncombed, but his eyes had been awake for hours. He set the pot on the railing, watching as a gray horse came to a slow stop at the weathered gate. The rider was Sheriff Townley. The same man had come here 3 weeks ago, carrying a hastily scrawled warrant and a look that didn't need to ask questions. That day, he hadn't entered the house, hadn't touched the coffee offered, hadn't bothered with greetings. He'd only said one thing. If she's still here by the 7th day, I'll return. Today was the 8th. Townley dismounted slowly, dusted off his gloves. No shackles hung at his belt. No deputy followed. Only a rolled bundle of papers tucked into his coat, and an expression worn but faded, like dust that had yet to settle. Eli opened the gate. He didn't say a word, just turned his back and left the porch door unlatched behind him, as though welcoming a neighbor for coffee, not a man who once brought a sentence in hand. Townley stepped inside. Nora was at the sink, washing the last of the breakfast dishes. She heard his boots on the floorboards, but didn't turn. She placed the final plate on the rack, dried her hands with a cloth, and sat down by the window, where the early gray light cast a thin edge of brightness along the table's surface. Townley didn't greet her. He didn't take a seat. He pulled the rolled papers from his coat and placed them on the aged pine table beside where she sat. There was a pause. Then he spoke, his voice rough, short, like a half-burnt tree stump. It wasn't you. Just 3 words. No apology, no trace of guilt, no shame. Just a fact, delivered like the name of a wind or the conclusion of a dry season. Nora looked down at the paper. Her fingers didn't reach for it. Her lips pressed together. No reaction. She only glanced toward Eli, who was now setting 2 cups of hot coffee on the table, one for the guest, one for himself. He didn't ask for details, didn't extend pleasantries. Townley finally sat, lifted his cup, sipped. No one brought up who had spoken, but the evidence lay plain between them. The name on the testimony belonged to the cook at the Woodrow Ranch, the man who had served dinner the night Nora was locked in a pitch-black room for 3 days. And the accused? The ranch owner's younger brother, the one who had treated Nora like a debt to be silenced. There was no trial, just a brief report, and at the bottom, bold print. Warrant for the arrest of Nora Bellamy is hereby void as of October 12, 1888. Townley drank half his cup. He glanced around the tidy kitchen, at the fire still glowing in the hearth, at a lilac-embroidered towel drying by the sink, signs of someone who hadn't run. Then he rose. "What happened this morning?" he began. Then paused, shook his head. "You understand." Eli neither nodded nor answered. He simply stepped forward and opened the door. Townley walked past him, didn't look back. His horse stood still at the gate, as if it had never left. Just before mounting, Townley stopped. "You know," he said, "some folks think she deserves an apology." Eli didn't reply. He simply looked him in the eye. Not with anger, not with relief, just the gaze of a man who'd known what it meant to lose, and understood that some things couldn't be repaid with words. Townley mounted up. The wind stirred gently across the hillside. He rode away, leaving behind a thin veil of dust that vanished quickly into the fading mist. Inside, Nora remained seated. The paper lay untouched, but her hands no longer curled in her lap. Her index finger traced the edge slowly, as if to feel its weight. As if to confirm. This time, it was real. And they had finally written it right. Eli returned to the kitchen. He didn't ask how she felt. Didn't say, "I'm glad," or "It's over now." He simply topped off his coffee and sat beside her. After a moment, Nora rose, folded the paper, and tucked it into the drawer near the stove. "I'll keep it," she said softly, almost to herself. Not to prove anything, but to remember that sometimes the truth does get heard. The words needed no reply. Eli sipped his coffee, and in that moment, two people sitting side by side, neither leaving, neither pushing the other to speak, something unnamed began to settle between them. Not quite trust, but a quiet assurance, stitched from what had survived. Outside, the sun still hadn't broken through, but light had begun to lay across the grass. You don't need a sunrise to know a new day has begun. The morning after, there was no rain, but the earth still held dampness. Beneath the old cottonwoods behind the house, the ground bore the faint tracks of crows that had passed through the night. There were no birdsongs, only the whisper of wind rustling through yellowing leaves. The white dress had been washed and was now strung between two tree trunks. The fabric caught the breeze, the worn lace at the collar curling softly, as if smiling at the early light. It didn't look like a flag of distress, nor a banner of surrender. It was simply a mark that someone had worn it, had been here, and was still choosing to stay. Nora stood on the porch steps, a dented tin basin in her hands still dripping water. Her hair was tied back, her clothes plain. She didn't look like a bride, nor someone in penance, just a woman learning how to remain in one place. She stepped down, one rung at a time, and walked around to the back of the house. The old garden lay open, patchy with wild grass, leaning stakes eaten soft by weather. Beneath the cracked soil lay forgotten seeds, maybe tomatoes, maybe parsley. No one quite remembered. Nora lifted the small spade from its hook. She didn't ask, didn't plan. She just started digging with her hands, lifting stones, turning dead roots, as if uncovering someone else's long-buried memory. Inside, Eli had risen early too, but today he didn't fetch wood. Instead, he stood near the horse pen, staring at the broken trough collapsed by last winter's freeze. He'd told himself he'd fix it in the spring. Then spring passed, and summer too. But this morning, without clear reason, he went to the shed, fetched his hammer, and started cutting new boards. No one asked why, but everything kept going. By noon, the wind picked up. The white dress caught in a branch. Nora had to stand on a wooden stool to free it, folding it carefully and carrying it indoors. She laid it on the bed, smoothed it flat. It no longer smelled of soap, but of sunlight and dust, the scent of time. Just then, Eli stepped into the room, sawdust still on his sleeves. He paused in the doorway, didn't step forward. His eyes fell on the dress. He gave a slight nod. "I'll build you another shelf tomorrow. The old wardrobe's getting tight." Nora didn't answer. She simply folded the dress, placed it in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, and closed the lid. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a thank you, folded, kept, and needing no voice. By late afternoon, the sky had turned from gray-blue to a soft ash rose, not a blazing sunset, just a day easing backward without noise. While Nora weeded near the fence, a child appeared at the far end of the red dirt road, hat in hand, cheeks streaked with dust. He stood there, hesitant, then called out loudly, "Is anyone home?" Eli came out first. The boy, 12 maybe, was breathless, his hands trembling from cold. "My pa fell off his horse near the creek, broke his leg. Nobody's been by. Your place was the closest." No questions. Eli grabbed his coat and horse and only turned once, calling back to Nora, "Fire's already going. Warm a pot of water. I'll be back before dark." Nora nodded. No panic, no fuss, just moved. About 2 hours later, Eli returned, supporting a man slumped against him, his left leg hastily splinted with torn shirting. The boy trailed behind, leading the horse, shivering. Nora took the man's arm, guiding him into the parlor. She didn't ask for names, didn't demand explanation. She fetched cloth, water, and began tending the wound as if she'd done it all her life. The man's name was Roy, a solitary herdsman who lived several miles east. The boy was his son, Seth. "Horse threw me, hit my head on a rock. Lucky the boy ran," Roy murmured, pain etched deep in his face. Eli rewrapped the leg, settled Roy onto the couch by the fire. Seth was given toasted bread and honey, warm milk. His wide eyes followed Nora, curious but not afraid. "Ma's gone. I never saw a wedding dress before. Only in books," he whispered, gaze fixed on the white cloth now hanging by the stove to dry. Nora laughed, for the first time in days. Not loud, just a breath with rhythm, but enough to make Eli look over. "Not a wedding dress, Seth," she said gently. "Just a piece of cloth used again." The boy nodded, as if that told him something far larger than clothes. As night fell, Nora brought more blankets. Eli added wood to the fire. They didn't talk about who'd do what. No plan, no delegation. It all moved naturally, like something that had already settled into place, long before names were exchanged. Roy slept, leg raised. Seth dozed beside him, cheek on his father's sleeve. In the timbered room, the fire crackled softly, steady as 4 breathing bodies, 2 once lost, and 2 just found their way. Before bed, Nora stood by the window. Moonlight lit the white dress, still damp, still swaying gently on the line. She thought, maybe I'll put it away tomorrow. Not because it had served its purpose, but because it no longer needed to prove anything. That night, she slept deeply, for the first time in a long time, not turned toward the window. The morning after Roy and Seth left the ranch, the wind carried a damp mist through the old windows, like a soft reminder that life, in its quiet way, still persisted. They had left early, before the sun crested the hills. Eli had helped Roy fasten the saddle, his hands steady, deliberate, as if binding something that ought not fall apart. Roy nodded once in thanks, his gait still uneven. Seth ran to Nora, wrapping his arms around her before climbing up. "You're the first person to tell me a story since my mama died," he whispered, his cheek pressed against her coarse cotton coat. Nora hesitated, then bent to rest her head lightly against his stiff, dust-slicked hair. "Next time you come back, bring bean seeds," she said. No smile. "The soil here likes beans." Seth nodded hard, his eyes brighter than when he'd arrived. He waved as their horse began rolling through the ranch gate, fading down the familiar red dirt path of Cedar Hollow. Once the sound of hooves dissolved into wind, Eli didn't return inside right away. He stood still, hand brushing the brim of his hat, eyes lingering as though trying to hold on to the small thing that had just left. It wasn't until Nora gently touched the crook of his arm that they returned to the quiet they had grown used to. That afternoon, Eli led Nora to the back shed. The ranch had 3 buildings: the main house they lived in, the stable, and an old storage barn. Once Eli's carpentry shop in younger years. The sliding door groaned like a tired cough from a throat that still remembered how to breathe. Inside, there was no mold, only dust, sawdust, and the kind of quiet that settled over things left untouched. In one corner, a broken table leg leaned sideways, a saddle chewed raw by mice, and in the middle of the floor, forgotten and half-finished, stood a wooden frame. A cradle. It had been made from fir, the kind Sarah loved because its resin reminded her of their first shared Christmas on the ranch. When she announced her pregnancy, Eli had begun the cradle quietly, in the way he did all things. He'd never spoken of it, not even after it remained unfinished. Sarah had died of hemorrhage a week after the news, and the cradle became something Eli couldn't bring himself to touch. Not because of grief, but because touching it would have meant admitting that a future had once truly been there. "I left it here for 4 years, Eli said, voice dry as sun-split timber. "Thought about burning it once. Didn't." Nora didn't ask why. She stepped forward and placed her hand along the curve of the frame, its grain dulled, but the shape still soft, like the echo of a hand that once wanted to hold something not yet born. "I once thought maybe I shouldn't have children," Eli added, eyes fixed on the wood. "Not because I didn't want to, but because I was scared to lose something again." Nora said nothing. Instead, she pulled from her pocket a small handkerchief, undyed, hemmed in green thread, with a single slanted end stitched in the corner. She folded it in quarters, then laid it gently in the cradle. Not like someone mourning the dead, but like someone making room for something still breathing. Neither spoke. But the silence itself felt like a vow, fragile, unsigned, and entirely voluntary. No one promised a child, but the handkerchief was a kind of courage. Nora's quiet way of saying she wasn't running anymore. That even after all that had been lost, she still had enough of herself left to place her name in something uncertain. That afternoon, Eli took sandpaper to the cradle. Nora didn't ask what he planned to do, but when she saw him measuring the axle again, sorting through the salvage pile for usable wood, she knew the cradle would have wheels. Not because a baby was coming, but because some things don't need a reason to be completed. like how someone mends a torn shirt not to wear it out again, but to keep it from unraveling in memory. That evening, they ate late. Nora had made bean soup from the seeds Seth had left behind. Before the first spoonful, Eli sat quietly, turning the silverware in his hand, as if weighing something. At last, he said, "Tomorrow I'm heading up the ridge to cut some walnut. Sarah always wanted a bookshelf in the bedroom. Want me to build you one too?" Nora nodded slowly. "Just don't varnish it. I like the grain raw." "I know." 3 simple words, but this time they carried more than familiarity. They carried something steady. Night came. As Nora lit the bedside lamp, she glanced through the window, where the cleaned cradle now rested near Eli's workbench. No one called it a baby cradle. No one mentioned someday. But in the low light, she could still see the natural fiber handkerchief lying there. A quiet speck. Something soft enough to remain. She didn't believe in redemption, but she believed in people who fix what was left undone, for no reason other than that it was waiting. And some nights, like this one, that was enough to make her feel like she wasn't drifting anymore. Snow began falling late in the afternoon. It didn't swirl with wind. It didn't whistle through the boards. It simply drifted down, fine, white, steady, like chalk dust settling over a world that had finally learned how to be still. Eli latched the front door just before nightfall. He stepped back in, brushed the snow from his coat, quiet in the way a man moves when he doesn't want to disturb a peace that's already settled in the kitchen. In the bedroom, Nora was brushing her hair before the mirror. It had grown longer, not the tight, watchful braid of someone ready to leave, but the kind of hair kept by someone learning to stay. She didn't ask if Eli was cold. She didn't pour the tea. But the broom by the door had already been brought inside since midday, like someone had thought ahead on his behalf. In the corner, Eli sat with an old saddle in his lap. A stitch had come loose. He pulled the thread gently, then threaded it again. His hands were no longer steady as they once were, but the motion held enough patience to believe every tear can mend if you're not in a hurry. They didn't speak, but not because there was nothing to say. They had simply found a way to live in parallel, like 2 quiet streams running side by side, never clashing, never claiming, always flowing toward the same horizon. Each evening, the kitchen became an unspoken meeting point for gentle repetition. Nora always made just enough for 2, never too much, never too little. Eli always washed the dishes, his hands needing something to do after the day, a silent reflection. The tablecloth was folded carefully after every meal, not for neatness, but like a whispered way of saying, "This day was lived well." They lived like that nearly a month, since the cradle had been placed back into the corner of the barn. No grand moments. No one asked, "Are you happy?" No one said, "I need you." But winter grew deeper. Snow stacked heavier on the roof, and still, the house stayed warm. It was a kind of existence that needed no proof. One night, when the wind shifted, Nora woke to the groaning creak of a floorboard under the porch. Nothing strange, just the stretch of dry wood recalling past winters in its bones. She slipped from bed, wrapped in a shawl, and walked to the kitchen. No light. Just a need to know the fire was still going. And it was. The stove glowed soft, red in its heart. Someone, clearly Eli, had risen in the dark and fed it. On the table, a scrap of paper, pencil scribbled, "Storm's coming in. I'm out checking the tin roof at the barn. Back soon." No name. But the slanted A in A-inch bore the same lean it had when Eli used to write letters to Sarah. Nora brewed tea and placed it under a cozy, then sat near the window. Outside, the snow thickened like a white wall. Yet she didn't feel cold. There was no fear of being left behind, only a quiet knowing that footsteps would return across that porch. And when Eli did, snow clinging to his coat, hands trembling faintly from the cold, she didn't ask what happened at the barn. She just poured tea and slid it toward him. Eli sat, palms warming on the mug. The mare's close to foaling. Could be tonight. Do you need someone to hold the lamp? She asked. He nodded, unable to hide the flicker of gratitude in his eyes. That night, in the barn, they held the lamp and each other's breath. The mare labored hard, hooves pawing gently at the straw. Outside, the snow fell thicker, but inside the world brightened under a single oil lamp and a gaze no longer filled with doubt. When the foal arrived, wet, shivering but alive, Nora knelt to wipe the damp hay from its muzzle. Eli's hand came to rest on her shoulder, light as the mare's exhale. They said nothing. But for the first time under the same roof, Nora turned, placed her hand over his, not from cold, not by accident, but because she chose to. That winter was longer than any in memory. The snow didn't stop for 3 weeks. The road to town was blocked. No mail, no guests. But the house never fell silent. It was full, not from numbers, but from the absence of leaving. Eli built a small window above the kitchen sink, where Nora often stood with her sleeves rolled. He didn't tell her, just built it. When she found it, she stood for a long while, then brought out the tablecloth and folded it neatly over the table. Only once that winter did someone knock. The old reverend, passing through on his way south to visit kin. He stayed for supper, speaking of his late wife, 42 years married before she passed. We started with a simple arrangement, he said, voice weathered but warm. But if love is quiet enough, it'll find its way into the spaces people forget to guard. Nora and Eli didn't answer. But that night, for the first time, Eli pulled out the handkerchief with the green N stitched in the corner, folded it, and placed it beside his wool cap. The next day, Nora left a short note on the table. I'm going up the hill to gather dry pine bark. Eli found it on his way in from the barn. He read it, folded it, tucked it into his coat pocket, like a letter meant to be kept longer than a day. He made tea, waited for her. Didn't ask when she'd be back. Didn't check the clock. Just waited. As one waits for a season they trust will return, even if late. When Nora stepped through the door again, snow on her shoulders, arms full of pine bark, Eli looked at her. No smile, but something glinted in his eyes, something unnamed. Need help drying those? He asked. No need, she answered, placing the bark on the kitchen counter. But instead of walking off, she stood, unwound her scarf slowly, folded it, then laid it beside Eli's wool cap, right next to the handkerchief marked with her name. The snow kept falling, but somehow that winter never crossed the threshold. Since that morning, Nora wrote 1 line a day. No more, no less. 1 line for 1 day fully lived. She used a small leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed with age, the very one Sarah had once used to jot down seed planting dates, calving seasons, and the times Eli went up the mountain. The first pages were already marked, smudged with old blue ink blurred by time. But Nora didn't tear them out. She simply turned to the next clean page, as if she weren't erasing a life once lived here, just continuing the sentence. The first line she wrote: I lived another day, not to run, but to see the sky. No title, no date, just a sentence, like breath. That morning, Eli didn't ask what she was writing, but as he swept the floor, he pulled down an old bottle of black ink from the shelf and placed it on the sunniest windowsill in the house. On the ledge, he set down a neat stack of trimmed paper beside a silver-bodied fountain pen, the same pen he'd once used to write letters to Sarah, untouched since the funeral. Nora saw it, said nothing. But at midday, when sunlight slanted in through the frosted glass, she paused mid-wipe at the kitchen table and stood quietly at the window, as if weighing something unspoken. That night, the second line appeared. Light didn't come looking for me, but I stayed still so it could find me. Since then, they began tending their mornings, not out of duty, but out of a wish to preserve them. Eli woke early to light the stove, always kept the kettle warm. Nora brought out extra salt for the horse stalls to keep ice from clinging to the beams. They didn't do each other's chores. Each stuck to their part. But every act was done with a gentleness that didn't need a name. She began reworking the garden behind the house, not planting anything ambitious. Just a few rows of greens, some chives, a corner of kale and winter onions. Things that could weather cold. Things that asked for patience. Eli rebuilt the fence around the grazing patch. One day, when Nora brought him tea, he said, I don't know how many years I've got left to need a good fence, but if you ever want to walk near the edge of the woods, I want you to not worry. Nora set the tea down, looked at him for a long moment, and nodded without a word. That night, her journal read, You can still be protected, even when nothing is threatening you. The morning began in silence, not the kind born of emptiness, but the kind that comes from having enough. Eli woke earlier than usual. The first light of April had just begun to slip through the kitchen window, drawing a thread-thin line like silk across the worn wooden floor. He didn't turn on the lamp, just stood there, letting himself be colored by morning, a pale blue so faint you had to stand still for a long while to tell it apart from yesterday's gray. And then he saw it. Sarah's old boots. Cleaned. The leather softened. The stitches still a little frayed, but burnished now. They sat neatly beside Nora's boots, left one tucked close to the right, as if someone had deliberately arranged both pairs to look toward the door. No note. No explanation. Just the act itself. Eli didn't need to ask who had done it. He knew. Nora had never spoken much about Sarah, Eli's late wife. She'd never once asked what he felt each time he passed the old bedroom, where a faded portrait still hung. Sarah, sitting beside a white horse, her hand resting lightly on its mane, hair tied high, eyes unreadable, caught somewhere between a smile and bracing against the sun. She didn't need to ask, because she understood. Some people, even after they're gone, remain in the corners of a house, not to be compared, not to be replaced, just still there, like the scent of an old breath lingering in a coat left untouched. Nora had never stepped into that room, but this morning, the fact that the boots had been cleaned, not with a dry rag, but with beeswax, told Eli one thing. She had gone in, not to look, but to fold shut a chapter that hadn't yet been touched. No one told her to do it, and no one had the right to stop her. She just did, quietly. as if leaving a greeting for someone who'd never had the chance to welcome her. The sky turned blue again, not the deep blue of summer, but a wary shade, as if it still remembered last week's frost and wasn't quite ready to believe the new season had come. Eli carried a wooden chair out onto the porch. He sat, holding a fountain pen he hadn't used in months, though he hadn't written a word. On the page before him, just a single shaky ink line, like testing a road, then stopping. He looked toward the garden. Nora was bent over, watering the newly sprouted carrots. Her hands moved gently, checking if the soil was moist enough. Her hair tied back, a loose strand brushing her cheek, left untouched. He didn't call to her, just watched, and saw. In that streak of sunlight, Nora was no longer a woman who had fled. She was part of this land, of this house, of this morning. That evening, Eli wrote his first line in months. I don't know why people stay, but I know I have to earn it. Every single day. He closed the notebook, showed it to no one. From across the room, Nora was sewing a tear in his old coat, the elbow rip from last year. Neither of them spoke, but when she finished, she laid the fuse coat over the back of his chair. And when he went to bed, there was a fresh blanket already laid out, washed and warm, faintly scented with lavender, familiar like the hand that once brushed his hair in a dream. It's the kind of love that needs no name, no vows, just someone who stays, long enough to share the silence without feeling alone. If this story made you pause, even for a heartbeat, leave us a comment. Tell us what part stayed with you. Hit like if you too believe that some loves are better left unspoken. And don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, where forgotten lives, in the end, find a place to be called home. Who should we write about next? A soldier returning from war? A girl traded for a piece of land? Comment below, we're listening.